Dr. Natasha Reeves stepped off the transport truck at Summit Ridge Research Station with nothing but a duffel bag and a compact helicopter that the entire expedition team would soon call adorable. 2 weeks later, that same machine mocked as a glorified drone by men who considered themselves experts would become the only barrier between 32 people and a frozen death in the most hostile environment on Earth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The research station sprawled across the Antarctic plateau like a collection of industrial shipping containers, which is essentially what it was. Prefabricated modules connected by heated corridors, surrounded by endless white emptiness that stretched to every horizon. This was Apex Geological Survey's crown jewel, a $400 million facility designed to extract core samples from beneath 3 miles of ice. Searching for climate data that could reshape humanity's understanding of prehistoric atmospheres, Natasha adjusted her thermal gear as she approached the main airlock. Her compact Whisper 7 helicopter secured on a flatbed sled behind her. The machine was sleek and small, roughly half the size of the station's primary aircraft, with a streamlined design that prioritized efficiency over intimidation. Its carbon fiber frame gleamed under the perpetual daylight of Antarctic summer. Lightweight rotors folded against the fuselage like insect wings. "That's your emergency medical transport?" A voice cut through the wind. Thick with barely concealed amusement, Station Commander Derek Vaughn stood in the airlock entrance, arms crossed, his expression carrying the particular brand of condescension reserved for people who believed credentials automatically translated to competence. His weathered face and ice-scarred hands spoke to genuine polar experience, but his eyes revealed a man who had stopped questioning his own assumptions years ago. Natasha kept her voice neutral. "It's a specialized high-altitude medical extraction vehicle, fully certified for polar operations. Looks like something my nephew flies in the park." Vaughn circled the Whisper 7, his skepticism obvious. "We've got 2 Sikorsky heavy lifts for serious work. This thing is..." "What, exactly?" "Back up," Natasha replied simply, not bothering to elaborate. Her credentials had cleared 6 months of background verification. She was here as the station's medical officer and emergency aviation specialist, though her file carefully omitted certain details about her previous assignments. Details that included 15 years flying rescue missions in environments where conventional helicopters failed catastrophically. The security scanner beeped as she passed through, her digital clearance registering her as Dr. Natasha Reeves, medical specialist, civilian contractor. Nothing in the system indicated her previous role with the Arctic Emergency Response Division, or the classified missions that had made her one of the world's foremost experts in extreme environment aviation. Those records had been sealed after a controversial rescue operation, and a whistleblower testimony that had made her radioactive to official programs. Her reassignment to Summit Ridge wasn't something she'd requested. It was administrative exile disguised as opportunity, arranged by contacts who needed someone reliable in this particular location, but couldn't officially acknowledge why. The station's interior buzzed with activity as the summer research season hit full intensity. Glaciologists analyzed core samples in spotless laboratories. Climate scientists studied computer models showing atmospheric changes across millennia. Engineers maintained the massive drilling equipment that penetrated ever deeper into prehistoric ice. Everyone moved with the focused purpose of people who'd traveled to the bottom of the world to advance human knowledge. A woman in an expedition parka approached, tablet in hand, professional smile firmly in place. "Dr. Reeves? I'm Station Coordinator Jennifer Walsh. Welcome to Summit Ridge. Your quarters are in Module 7. Medical Bay is Module 3. meal schedules, emergency protocols, and communication procedures are all on your tablet. Appreciated, Natasha replied, accepting the device. When can I inspect the primary medical evacuation aircraft? Walsh's smile tightened fractionally. The Sikorskis? Those are maintained by our flight operations team. Your role focuses on medical response rather than aviation maintenance. The careful phrasing wasn't accidental. Natasha had seen this pattern before, credentials acknowledged, just enough to satisfy paperwork, then quietly sidelined to prevent interference with established hierarchies. My certification includes emergency flight operations, Natasha noted calmly. Standard protocol requires cross-familiarization with all evacuation assets. Commander Vaughn oversees flight operations personally, Walsh replied, her tone suggesting the conversation was concluded. He'll brief you if he determines it's necessary. For now, focus on setting up your medical facility. We're expecting the geology team to return from deep field camp tomorrow, and several members will need routine medical evaluations. Natasha nodded without protest, recognizing a bureaucratic wall when she encountered one. She'd work within their system until circumstances required otherwise. Her assigned quarters were Spartan but functional. A narrow bunk, storage locker, desk with communication terminal, and a window showing nothing but ice stretching to infinity. She unpacked methodically, organizing medical supplies and emergency equipment with the precision of someone who'd learned that chaos began with small organizational failures. Through her window, she watched ground crew securing her Whisper 7 in the aviation hangar alongside the two massive Sikorsky helicopters. Even from a distance, the size difference was comical. Her machine looked like a child's toy parked beside industrial workhorses. A visual disparity that would feed endless mockery over the coming days. What they couldn't see, what the specifications, carefully buried in technical documentation, revealed was that her toy could operate in conditions that would ground every other aircraft at the station. Its experimental rotor design handled extreme turbulence with uncanny stability. Its lightweight frame required a fraction of the fuel while maintaining equivalent range. Most critically, its advanced avionics could navigate in total whiteout conditions where even the most experienced pilots flew blind. She'd helped design those systems during her years with Arctic emergency response, field testing prototypes in situations where mechanical failure meant certain death. The Whisper 7 represented the culmination of that work, an aircraft built not for impressive specifications, but for the specific edge cases where conventional machines became expensive coffins. As evening approached, though, evening remained a relative concept under 24-hour sunlight. Natasha made her way to the communal dining facility. The large space buzzed with conversation as researchers and support staff gathered for the day's main meal. She collected her tray and settled at an empty table, observing the social dynamics while reviewing station protocols on her tablet. A group of pilots occupied the corner table, their loud conversation carrying easily across the room. She recognized Commander Vaughn among them, along with several men wearing flight suits emblazoned with Apex Geological Survey insignia. Did anyone actually see the medical officer's helicopter? One of them asked, barely containing laughter. I thought they were joking when they loaded it off the transport. Probably bought it on Amazon, another responded, triggering a round of guffaws. Next day delivery to Antarctica. Vaughn's voice cut through the mockery with false diplomacy. The Whisper 7 is a certified aircraft. I'm sure Dr. Reeves has her reasons for selecting it. The words were correct, but his tone conveyed complete agreement with his colleague's assessment. Natasha continued eating without reaction, her expression revealing nothing. She'd encountered countless variations of this dynamic throughout her career. Skilled professionals whose confidence had calcified into arrogance, unable to recognize expertise that didn't match their preconceptions. What none of them knew, what couldn't have known, was that she'd been sent to Summit Ridge because someone in Arctic emergency response had detected troubling patterns in the station's safety reports. Equipment maintenance delays, ignored weather warnings, a culture that prioritized research schedules over operational caution. The kind of systemic negligence that created disasters. Her assignment wasn't medical support. It was insurance against catastrophe. As she returned her tray and headed back to her quarters, Natasha glanced toward the hangar where her toy helicopter waited. In 2 weeks, when a catastrophic storm system trapped the entire station and conventional evacuation became impossible, that machine would be the only thing between 32 people and death by exposure. But tonight, they laughed. And she let them. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Natasha's first week at Summit Ridge unfolded with methodical precision. She established the medical bay with practiced efficiency, organizing supplies according to emergency response protocols she'd refined over years of field operations. The facility was well-equipped trauma kits, diagnostic equipment, satellite communication, systems for remote consultation, everything necessary for handling medical crises thousands of miles from the nearest hospital. What interested her more than the medical equipment was what she observed during routine interactions throughout the station. Each morning, she conducted equipment checks that took her through different modules, clipboard in hand, ostensibly reviewing safety systems and emergency supplies. The role of medical officer granted her legitimate access to nearly every section of the facility, and she used this freedom to catalog details that had nothing to do with medicine. The maintenance logs for the Sikorsky helicopters showed concerning patterns. Scheduled inspections delayed by weeks. Minor mechanical issues marked as deferred with increasing frequency. Nothing catastrophic individually, but collectively painting a picture of an organization that prioritized research objectives over operational safety. In the climate analysis laboratory, she overheard conversations between senior scientists about upcoming weather systems. A major storm front was developing in the Ross Sea sector, predicted to reach Summit Ridge within 10 to 14 days. The meteorologists discussed it with academic interest rather than operational concern. Fascinating atmospheric dynamics, unusual pressure gradients, valuable data collection opportunities. No one mentioned evacuation protocols or discussed securing the station against extreme conditions. Dr. Reeves. Good morning. The voice belonged to Dr. Adrian Keller, the station's chief glaciologist. He was in his early 50s, with the lean build of someone who spent months in the field, and eyes that carried the intensity of a man completely absorbed in his work. Jennifer mentioned you wanted to review our deep field medical protocols? Standard familiarization, Natasha replied, accepting the data pad he offered. Your team operates up to 200 kilometers from the station. I need to understand response times and evacuation procedures if someone requires urgent medical attention. Keller scrolled through the documentation with practiced ease. We maintain daily communication windows via satellite. If there's a medical emergency, we can have someone back here within 4 hours using the Sikorskys. Commander Vaughn runs a tight operation. We've never had a serious incident in 7 years of deep field work. Natasha studied the evacuation timelines, noting the assumptions built into every calculation. Clear weather, functional aircraft, accessible landing zones. The plans worked perfectly under ideal conditions, which meant they were dangerously optimistic. What's the protocol if weather prevents helicopter operations? She asked. Keller's expression suggested he'd never seriously considered the scenario. We'd wait it out. The field camps are designed for extended occupation. Storm delays are inconvenient, but manageable. And if someone has a time-sensitive medical condition, appendicitis, cardiac event, severe trauma, then we'd fly anyway. Keller replied with the confidence of someone who'd never personally faced that decision. Vaughn's pilots are the best. They can handle challenging conditions. Natasha nodded without pressing further. She'd identified the critical vulnerability, institutional faith, and capabilities that had never been genuinely tested. Summit Ridge had operated for 7 years without catastrophic failure, which had created an organizational culture that mistook luck for competence. During her second afternoon at the station, she finally gained access to the aviation hangar. Commander Vaughn had reluctantly agreed to a facility tour after repeated requests framed as medical officer. Familiarization with evacuation assets. The hangar was impressive, a pressurized structure large enough to house both Sikorsky helicopters with room for maintenance operations. Heating systems maintained temperatures that allowed mechanics to work without extreme cold weather gear. Tool stations lined the walls, organized with military precision. The 2 Sikorsky S-92s dominated the space. Massive machines designed for offshore petroleum operations and adapted for polar conditions. They were formidable aircraft, capable of carrying substantial loads across vast distances. Natasha walked slowly around them, her trained eye cataloging details that the maintenance logs had already suggested. Hydraulic, fluid residue near a rotor joint. Slight discoloration on engine cowling suggesting incomplete repairs. Tool marks on access panels indicating frequent troubleshooting. Nothing immediately dangerous, but clear evidence of machines being pushed hard with insufficient maintenance intervals. Impressive aircraft, she commented neutrally. Vaughn stood with arms crossed, his posture defensive. Best polar helicopters in operation. We've logged over 2,000 flight hours without significant incidents. The maintenance logs show several deferred inspections. His expression hardened. We maintain these birds according to manufacturer specifications. Sometimes research priorities require flexible scheduling, but safety is never compromised. Natasha moved toward her Whisper 7, secured in the far corner like an afterthought. Someone had placed orange safety cones around it, which seemed unnecessarily cautious given its small size. Your machine seems very compact, Vaughn observed, his tone carefully diplomatic. It's designed for specific operational parameters, Natasha replied, running her hand along the fuselage with obvious familiarity. High-altitude performance, extreme weather stability, minimal fuel consumption. Sure, but payload capacity? Vaughn gestured toward the Sikorskys. Those birds can carry 12 personnel plus equipment. How many can your toy manage? The word hung in the air between them. Toy, said without obvious malice, but with the casual dismissiveness of someone who'd already formed irreversible conclusions. 4 personnel comfortably. 6 in emergency configuration, Natasha answered evenly. The Whisper 7 isn't designed to replace heavy lift aircraft. It fills different operational requirements, such as flying in conditions where conventional helicopters can't operate safely. Vaughn's expression suggested polite skepticism. Dr. Reeves, I've been flying in Antarctica for 12 years. I know what polar aviation requires. Bigger is better down here, more power reserves, more redundancy, more margin for error. Small aircraft are death traps when conditions deteriorate. Natasha could have explained the advanced rotor dynamics that allowed the Whisper 7 to handle turbulence. That would shake larger helicopters apart. She could have detailed the experimental avionics that maintained stable flight in zero visibility. She could have mentioned the classified rescue operations where machines exactly like this one had saved lives in situations where conventional wisdom said flight was impossible. Instead, she simply nodded. I appreciate the guidance, Commander. That evening in the dining facility, the mockery had evolved from casual amusement to running joke. One of the younger pilots had nicknamed her helicopter Tinkerbell, and the name spread through the station with viral enthusiasm. Personnel who'd never seen the aircraft made jokes about it during meals. Someone created a satirical safety poster showing the Whisper 7 with cartoonish modifications. Natasha observed this with clinical detachment, recognizing it as a social bonding mechanism that reinforced group identity at her expense. She could have corrected their assumptions, established dominance through credentialing and expertise. But that would have only created defensive resistance. Better to remain underestimated. To let them laugh while she gathered information. On her fourth day, she encountered the station's head of logistics, a woman named Patricia Oconcho, who managed supply chains with ruthless efficiency. Patricia had the practical competence of someone who understood that successful Antarctic operations depended on unglamorous attention to detail. Dr. Reeves, Patricia greeted her in the supply depot. Need something from inventory? Just familiarizing myself with emergency stocks. Medical supplies, survival equipment, backup power systems. Patricia pulled up inventory lists on her tablet. We maintain 6 months of redundant supplies for everything critical. The bureaucrats back home love their safety margins. She paused, studying Natasha with shrewd eyes. You're very thorough for someone in a medical role. Emergencies rarely respect job descriptions. True enough. Patricia handed her the tablet. Between us, I'm glad someone's actually reviewing these systems. Most people assume everything works perfectly until the moment it doesn't. It was the first hint that someone else at the station shared Natasha's concerns about complacency. You've been here. What, 3 years? Natasha asked. 4, long enough to see patterns. Command gets focused on research targets. Maintenance gets deferred. Safety margins gradually erode. Then winter arrives. Everyone goes home. And next season starts fresh with no institutional memory of the close calls. Patricia lowered her voice. Last year we had a generator failure during a cold snap. Nearly lost heating to 3 modules before we got it working. The incident report got filed under minor equipment malfunction, but it wasn't minor. It was terrifying. Just didn't escalate into disaster, so officially, it barely happened. Patricia met her gaze directly. You're not really just a medical officer, are you? Natasha considered her response carefully. I have broader qualifications than my title suggests. Good, because something feels off about this season. Can't explain it, just the way decisions are being made. Priorities. Patricia shook her head. Maybe I'm paranoid from too many winters down here. Paranoia is just pattern recognition in advance, Natasha replied. What specifically concerns you? The storm system developing in the Ross Sea. Meteorology says it's unusually large, moving unpredictably. But Vaughn and Keller are pushing to keep the deep field camp operational right through its projected path. 20 people out there with no quick extraction if conditions deteriorate. Natasha pulled up weather data on her tablet, studying the atmospheric models. The storm system was massive, a circular formation of low pressure that was still organizing, but showed potential for extreme intensity. The projections had significant uncertainty, which meant it could dissipate harmlessly or explode into something catastrophic. Has anyone recommended pulling the field team back as a precaution? The junior meteorologist suggested it yesterday. Keller shut him down in about 30 seconds. Research schedule is already compressed, can't afford delays, weather models are always overly cautious, etc. Patricia's expression was grim. Classic normalization of risk. Over the following days, Natasha intensified her quiet investigation. She accessed weather data during off hours, comparing current atmospheric conditions to historical storm patterns. She reviewed the station's emergency response plans, identifying gaps between documented procedures and actual capabilities. She observed the social dynamics, noting who asked critical questions and who dismissed concerns. The picture that emerged was troublingly clear. Summit Ridge had succeeded for 7 years through combination of good luck and generally favorable conditions. That success had bred institutional confidence that masked serious vulnerabilities. The station's safety systems existed primarily on paper, never genuinely tested against the extreme scenarios they were theoretically designed to handle. And now, a weather system unlike anything in the facility's operational history was developing offshore. While 20 researchers remained unexposed, field camps and the primary evacuation aircraft showed maintenance deferrals that would normally ground them in any properly managed operation. On the evening of her 7th day at Summit Ridge, Natasha stood in her quarters reviewing the data she'd compiled. The storm would arrive in approximately 1 week. When it hit, and her analysis suggested when, rather than if, this facility would face conditions that would expose every weakness she'd identified. Her Whisper 7 sat in the hangar, dismissed as a toy by people who couldn't imagine circumstances where conventional wisdom failed catastrophic ally. In 8 days, they would learn otherwise, but tonight they still laughed. And she continued letting them. By the 9th day at Summit Ridge, the atmosphere had shifted in ways most personnel didn't consciously recognize. Natasha felt it during morning briefings, a subtle tension beneath the professional routines. Like pressure building behind a dam. Commander Vaughn stood at the head of the conference room, weather displays illuminated behind him. The Ross Sea system continues tracking northeast. Current projections show it passing approximately 300 kilometers south of our position. We're implementing standard storm protocols, securing external equipment, checking backup power systems, standard operational procedure. Natasha studied the meteorological data on her tablet. The storm had organized faster than initial models predicted, its circular structure tightening into a well-defined low-pressure cell. Wind speeds at the core were approaching Category 3 hurricane equivalents, and the system was still intensifying. "What about the deep field camp?" asked Dr. Rachel Tomlinson, one of the senior climate researchers. "They're directly in the projected path. Current timeline has the system reaching their position in approximately 96 hours, Vaughn replied. "We're monitoring continuously. If conditions warrant evacuation, we'll execute extraction with plenty of margin." Natasha raised her hand, keeping her tone professionally neutral. "The uncertainty cone on those projections is quite wide. The storm could track significantly further north than the median prediction." Vaughn's expression tightened fractionally. "We're aware of the uncertainty, Dr. Reeves. That's why we're monitoring. We don't evacuate based on worst-case scenarios that statistically have low probability. What's the evacuation timeline if you need to extract 20 people from deep field?" 4 Sikorsky flights, approximately 90 minutes per round trip depending on conditions. "We can have everyone back here within 8 hours of decision to evacuate." His tone suggested the conversation was concluded, but Natasha pressed forward. "And if weather deteriorates during extraction? If the window closes partway through?" The room had gone quiet, other personnel watching the exchange with uncomfortable interest. Challenging Vaughn's operational decisions wasn't standard protocol, especially for someone in a medical support role. "Then we adapt," Vaughn said sharply. "Dr. Reeves, I appreciate your concern, but flight operations are my responsibility. I've been flying in Antarctic conditions for over a decade. I know how to assess risk." Natasha nodded once and said nothing further. She'd made her point not to Vaughn, who was already committed to his assessment, but to others in the room who might remember this conversation when circumstances changed. After the briefing, Patricia Okonfew caught up with her in the corridor. "You're making friends quickly," she observed dryly. "Someone needs to ask the uncomfortable questions." "True. But Vaughn doesn't respond well to having his judgment questioned, especially not publicly." Patricia glanced around to ensure privacy. "Between us, I agree with you. Those weather models have huge error bars. But command culture here doesn't reward caution. What about station director oversight?" Surely there's someone above Vaughn who reviews these decisions? Patricia's expression was grim. Station Director Hammond is back in Christchurch for medical treatment kidney stones. Won't return for another 2 weeks. That leaves Vaughn as senior operational authority. Keller technically outranks him in the research hierarchy, but defer to Vaughn on all aviation and safety matters, which meant operational decisions were concentrated in the hands of someone whose judgment Natasha had already identified as dangerously overconfident. That afternoon, she conducted what she termed a comprehensive medical equipment audit that took her through every module of the station. In reality, she was mapping vulnerabilities with systematic precision. Which sections had backup power? Where were emergency supplies concentrated? What were the actual, not theoretical evacuation routes if primary corridors became compromised? In the communications module, she encountered Thomas Chun, the junior meteorologist who'd suggested evacuating the field camp. He was young, perhaps 27, with the nervous energy of someone still early in their career and uncertain about challenging authority. "Dr. Reeves," he acknowledged, barely glancing up from the weather displays. "How's the Ross Sea system developing?" Thomas's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up enhanced satellite imagery. "It's organizing faster than any model predicted. The pressure gradient is intensifying, which means wind speeds are increasing. Look at this convective structure. It's almost tropical cyclone characteristics, which shouldn't happen in Antarctic waters." Natasha studied the swirling mass of clouds. Even to her non-specialist eye, the storm looked ominous. "Your recommendation to evacuate the field camp, you still think that's necessary?" "I think it's prudent," Thomas replied carefully. "But I'm just a meteorologist. Commander Vaughn has operational experience I don't have. Maybe I'm being overly cautious. Or maybe experience creates confidence that becomes indistinguishable from complacency," Natasha said quietly. "What does your data tell you, independent of what authority figures say?" Thomas met her gaze, and she saw the conflict in his eyes, the tension between what his analysis suggested and what institutional hierarchy expected. "My data says this storm has a 35% probability of tracking north of current projections. If it does, the deep field camp will experience winds exceeding 150 kilometers per hour with zero visibility. Evacuation during those conditions would be extremely dangerous, possibly impossible. Have you communicated this to Vaughn?" "I tried. He said 35% doesn't warrant disrupting research operations." "He's probably right. 65% probability it stays south, right?" Thomas's voice carried the desperation of someone trying to convince himself. Natasha placed a hand on his shoulder. "Trust your analysis. Document everything. And be ready to present it again when circumstances change. You think the storm is going to hit us? I think we should be prepared for that possibility." The following morning brought the first concrete sign that the situation was deteriorating. Natasha was in the medical bay, organizing supplies when her tablet chimed with an emergency notification. She pulled it up immediately. "Weather update. Ross Sea system has intensified to Category 4 equivalent. Track deviation detected system now projected 40%. Probability of passing within 100 kilometers of summit ridge. Deep field camp lies directly in projected path. Arrival time, 72 hours. She was moving before she'd finished reading, heading directly toward the command center where Vaughn would be receiving the same data. She arrived to find him already surrounded by concerned personnel, his expression tight as he studied multiple weather displays. "Options," he said curtly to his flight operations team. "We can begin evacuation immediately," replied his senior pilot, a grizzled man named Frank Morrison. "Get the first group out within 2 hours. Complete extraction in 8 to 10 hours depending on conditions at the camp." "Current weather at deep field?" Vaughn asked. "Deteriorating, but manageable. Winds 30 kilometers per hour, visibility decent. They've got maybe 36 hours before conditions become genuinely dangerous. Vaughn nodded slowly, and Natasha could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. Evacuate now and disrupt critical research if the storm tracks south as originally predicted. Wait and maintain operations if the storm stayed on its expected course. We'll implement staged withdrawal, Vaughn decided. Non-essential personnel and critical samples extracted first. Research team remains until we have better certainty on the storm track. Begin preparations for first extraction flight in 4 hours. It was a compromise that satisfied no one and protected nothing. The classic institutional response that tried to split the difference between competing pressures. Commander, Natasha interjected. With respect, partial evacuation increases risk. Either the camp is safe or it isn't. Leaving people there while conditions deteriorate, Dr. Reeves. Vaughn cut her off with barely restrained irritation. Your medical expertise is valued, but operational planning is not your domain. We're taking appropriate precautions while maintaining scientific objectives. That's the decision. The meeting concluded shortly after, personnel dispersing to their assignments with obvious tension. As Natasha left the command center, she nearly collided with Dr. Adrian Keller, who'd been listening from the doorway. You're very concerned about this storm, he observed, falling into step beside her. I'm concerned about the gap between our capabilities and our confidence. Keller studied her with newfound interest. You don't talk like a typical medical officer. Your background, there's more to it than what's in your official file, isn't there? Natasha considered how much to reveal. I have experience with emergency operations in extreme environments. That experience suggests we're underestimating the risks we're facing. Underestimating how? The Sikorskys are impressive machines, but they have operational limits. If weather deteriorates beyond certain thresholds, they can't fly safely regardless of pilot skill. At that point, we need alternatives. Understanding dawned in Keller's expression. Your helicopter. The one everyone's been mocking. The Whisper 7 has different operational parameters. It's designed specifically for conditions where conventional aircraft can't operate. Can you substantiate that claim? Not without compromising information I'm not authorized to discuss. But yes, if circumstances require proof, I can provide it. Keller was silent for a long moment, weighing what she'd told him against his own assessment of the situation. I hope you're wrong about how this develops, Dr. Reeves, but I'm beginning to suspect you're not. That evening, Natasha conducted a thorough pre-flight inspection of the Whisper 7. Working alone in the hangar after most personnel had retired for the night, she checked every system with meticulous precision: rotor mechanisms, avionics, fuel systems, emergency equipment. The aircraft was in perfect condition, which was fortunate because she suspected it would soon be tested beyond anything its designers had anticipated. She was securing the engine cowling when she heard footsteps approaching. Patricia Okonchu emerged from the shadows, carrying 2 insulated mugs. Thought you might need coffee, Patricia said, offering one of the mugs. Appreciated. Natasha accepted gratefully. The warmth welcome in the hangar's chill. Patricia studied the Whisper 7 with new appreciation. Is this thing really as capable as you've been suggesting? More capable than anyone here realizes. But capability only matters if people are willing to use it when the time comes. Vaughn won't authorize you to fly rescue missions. He barely acknowledges your aircraft exists. Then we need to make sure circumstances don't require his authorization. Natasha met Patricia's gaze directly. If this situation develops the way I think it will, there'll be a point where official protocols break down. At that moment, we'll need people willing to act without waiting for permission. Patricia considered this carefully. You're talking about going outside the command structure. I'm talking about having options when the command structure fails. Which it will, because it's built on assumptions that don't match reality. That's a serious accusation. It's an accurate assessment. Vaughn is a skilled pilot operating within a mental model that's never been genuinely challenged. When that model encounters conditions it wasn't designed for, it will collapse. We need to be ready for that moment. Patricia took a long drink from her mug, staring at the Whisper 7. You know, when you first arrived with this little helicopter, I thought it was ridiculous too. But I've learned to trust people who prepare for scenarios everyone else dismisses as impossible. Then help me prepare. Because in approximately 60 hours, this facility is going to face something it's never encountered before. And when that happens, institutional confidence won't protect anyone. They stood together in the quiet hangar. Two women who'd recognized the approaching crisis while others remained convinced their systems would protect them. Outside, the Antarctic wind was beginning to increase. The first whisper of the massive storm system that was bearing down on Summit Ridge. With devastating inevitability, the laughter about Natasha's toy helicopter had faded over the past few days, replaced by an uneasy tension that permeated the station. But dismissal remained, the fundamental institutional belief that their equipment, their procedures, their experience would be sufficient. In 60 hours, that belief would shatter. And Natasha's toy would become the difference between survival and catastrophe. The first Sikorsky lifted off at 0600 hours the following morning. Rotors churning through air that had grown noticeably thicker with approaching weather. Natasha watched from the observation window of the medical bay as the massive helicopter disappeared into the gray distance, heading toward the deep field camp 200 kilometers away. She'd spent the night reviewing evacuation protocols and preparing emergency medical supplies for potential casualties. The storm was now 54 hours out, and the latest meteorological data confirmed her worst suspicions. The system had shifted further north, placing Summit Ridge directly in its projected path. Thomas Chun found her an hour later, his face pale with exhaustion. He clearly hadn't slept. The models are converging, he said without preamble, pulling up data on his tablet. Every major forecasting system now shows the storm tracking within 50 kilometers of our position. Wind speeds at the core are sustained at 190 kilometers per hour with gusts potentially exceeding 240. Dr. Reeves, this is going to be catastrophic. Natasha studied the atmospheric pressure charts. The storm had developed an eye, a clear sign of extreme organization and intensity. Has Vaughn seen this data? He's in the command center now. I just briefed him. Thomas's hands trembled slightly. He's ordered immediate full evacuation of the deep field camp. All non-essential personnel are being recalled to Summit Ridge. The problem is the timeline, Natasha finished. The storm is moving faster than anticipated. Exactly. At current speed, we have maybe 36 hours before conditions become too dangerous for the Sikorskys to fly. Getting 20 people out requires multiple flights. And each round trip takes longer as weather deteriorates. They move together toward the command center, arriving to find it transformed into a crisis coordination hub. Weather displays covered every available screen. Flight operations personnel huddled around communication consoles. Vaughn stood at the center, issuing rapid-fire instructions. First Sikorsky is inbound with 6 personnel and critical samples, reported Frank Morrison, Vaughn's senior pilot. Weather at deep field is deteriorating faster than predicted. Visibility dropping, winds increasing. We're looking at maybe 4 more flights before conditions exceed safe operating limits. That's 24 people maximum, noted Dr. Keller, who'd been pulled into the crisis coordination. We have 20 people at the camp. We'll get everyone, Vaughn insisted, but uncertainty flickered across his features. Accelerate the flight rotation. Minimize ground time between missions. Frank, you take the second run. I'll pilot the third. Natasha stepped forward. Commander, I recommend positioning my aircraft as backup for the final extraction. Vaughn barely glanced at her. Your helicopter can carry 4 people. That doesn't solve our capacity problem. It solves the problem if your Sikorskys can't complete all the flights. The Whisper 7 can operate in conditions that would ground conventional aircraft. Dr. Reeves, I appreciate the offer, but this is not the time for experimental aviation. We're using proven systems with experienced crews. His tone was dismissive. Attention already returning to the operational displays. Patricia Okonkwo caught Natasha's eye from across the room, her expression conveying clear frustration with Vaughn's intransigence. But there was nothing more to be said, not yet. Vaughn remained convinced his systems would be sufficient, and until that confidence was proven misplaced, he controlled operational decisions. The second Sikorsky departed 90 minutes after the first returned. The weather had visibly deteriorated in that brief interval. Wind speeds at Summit Ridge had increased to 40 kilometers per hour, and thick clouds were rolling in from the south. Like a gray avalanche, Natasha returned to the hangar and began methodical pre-flight preparations on the Whisper 7. She checked fuel reserves, tested avionics, verified emergency equipment. If circumstances required her aircraft, there would be no time for preparation. Everything had to be ready for immediate deployment. She was calibrating the navigation systems when footsteps approached. Dr. Adrian Keller had followed her from the command center. "You really think Vaughn's plan won't work?" he said. It wasn't a question. "I think it's optimistic, which means it's dangerous." Keller watched as she moved through her pre-flight checklist with obvious expertise. "You're not really just a medical officer, are you? Your credentials, your knowledge of aviation systems, the way you've been preparing for this, who are you actually?" Natasha paused, meeting his gaze directly. "Someone who's seen what happens when institutional confidence exceeds actual capability. I'm here because people in positions of authority suspected Summit Ridge was developing exactly the kind of systemic vulnerabilities that create disasters. And now we're facing that disaster. Now we're facing a situation where all the optimistic assumptions get tested against reality. Some will hold. Many won't. When they fail, we'll need alternatives that weren't part of the original plan." Keller processed this, his scientific mind evaluating the logic. "What do you need from me?" "Access to communication systems and authorization to deploy if Vaughn's evacuation plan fails. When that moment comes, there won't be time for debates about protocol. People who need rescue won't care about institutional hierarchy. I can't override Vaughn's operational authority, but you can provide cover if I have to act outside that authority. The station director is absent. You're the senior researcher present. In an emergency, your voice carries weight." Keller hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the implications of what she was proposing. "You're asking me to support insubordination. I'm asking you to support saving lives when official protocols prove inadequate." Before Keller could respond, alarms blared throughout the station. Both of them rushed back to the command center, arriving to find controlled chaos. The second Sikorsky had encountered severe turbulence en route to the deep field camp. Frank Morrison's voice crackled over the radio, tense but professional. "Summit Ridge, we're experiencing significant wind shear. Visibility near zero. Attempting to push through, but conditions are worse than forecast. Can you reach the camp?" Vaughn demanded. A long pause filled with static. "Negative. Winds are exceeding operational limits for this airframe. Attempting to hold position, but being pushed off course. Recommend we abort and return to base." Vaughn's expression was stone. "Frank, we need those people extracted. How close can you get?" "Commander, I can't see 50 meters in front of me, and I'm fighting to maintain altitude. Pushing further would be reckless." The word hung in the air, reckless. Frank Morrison was a pilot with 20 years of experience, admitting the conditions exceeded his limits. That admission shifted something fundamental in the room's atmosphere. "Abort the mission," Vaughn said finally, the words clearly painful. Return to Summit Ridge. We'll reassess once you're back safely. As Frank Morrison fought his way back through deteriorating weather, Natasha pulled up the meteorological data. The storm had accelerated again, now projected to reach Summit Ridge in 28 hours instead of 36. The evacuation window was closing faster than anyone had anticipated. Thomas Chun was already recalculating timelines, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Even if weather improves temporarily, we're looking at maybe 2 more safe flight windows before the storm hits. That's 12 people maximum if we use both Sikorskis. 8 people will be stranded at the camp. No, Vaughn said flatly. That's not acceptable. We'll find a way. Commander, Natasha interjected, the Whisper 7 can reach the camp in these conditions. Let me attempt a reconnaissance flight. Assess the actual situation on site. Your aircraft is too small and unproven for this mission. It's specifically designed for extreme weather operations. The avionics can navigate in 0 visibility. The rotor system handles turbulence that larger helicopters can't manage. This is exactly the scenario it was built for. Vaughn turned to face her fully, frustration and desperation warring in his expression. Dr. Reeves, even if everything you claim is true, and I'm skeptical sending you out there puts another person at risk, I won't authorize it. Then we're condemning 8 people to face Category 4 winds in a field camp that wasn't designed for that level of exposure. The command center had gone silent. Everyone recognizing they were witnessing the moment where optimistic planning collided with harsh reality. Vaughn's entire operational framework was crumbling, his confidence revealed as insufficient against the storm's brutal indifference. What she didn't tell them was that she was flying almost entirely on instruments. Visibility had degraded to the point where her eyes provided essentially no useful information. Everything depended on the avionics systems mapping the invisible world around her, painting reality in electronic precision while her physical senses reported only white chaos. The Advanced Navigation Suite used multiple redundant systems, GPS satellites, inertial guidance, terrain mapping radar, atmospheric pressure analysis. Each system cross-checked the others thousands of times per second, creating a composite understanding of position and orientation that remained accurate within centimeters despite the violent conditions. 32 minutes after departure, the deep field camp appeared on her instruments before becoming visible to her eyes, a cluster of thermal signatures indicating occupied structures, barely distinguishable against the surrounding whiteness. She descended carefully, the Whisper 7's rotors automatically adjusting to ground effect as she approached the makeshift landing zone the camp had cleared. The wind was even more violent at surface level, unobstructed by terrain and channeled across the ice with destructive force. Several tents had already collapsed, their frames bent and broken by the relentless assault. The remaining structures were barely holding, fabric straining against tie-downs that wouldn't survive much longer. Natasha set down with delicate precision, the Whisper 7 settling onto its skids as if landing in calm conditions rather than catastrophic weather. She kept the rotors at operational speed shutting down. Completely would risk not being able to restart in these winds. Figures emerged from the main shelter tent, hunched against the wind, moving toward the helicopter with obvious desperation. Natasha opened the cockpit, wind immediately trying to rip the door from its hinges. She held it steady through pure strength, waving the camp personnel forward. Dr. Michael Torres, the deep field camp leader, reached her first. He had to shout to be heard over the combined roar of wind and rotors. Thank God you made it. Sarah's condition is deteriorating. She hasn't regained consciousness and the bleeding won't stop completely. Get her into the passenger compartment. Secure her as gently as possible, but prioritize speed. Natasha's medical training took over, evaluating the situation with clinical precision, even as part of her mind remained focused on the aircraft and the deteriorating weather. 4 camp personnel emerged carrying Dr. Sarah Hendricks on an improvised stretcher. Even through the storm, Natasha could see the severity of the injury, a deep gash across the woman's scalp. Blood staining the emergency bandages, her face unnaturally pale. They lifted her carefully into the Whisper 7's passenger compartment, securing her with restraints designed for medical evacuation. "How many can you take?" Torres shouted. Natasha did rapid calculations. The aircraft could carry 4 passengers normally, 6 in extreme emergency configuration. Sarah Hendricks occupied the space of 2 people due to her injuries and required medical attention. 3 more. Who else is critical? Torres gestured to 2 younger researchers, both showing signs of hypothermia and exhaustion. These 2, they were outside when the first tent collapsed. Dr. James Park and Dr. Lisa Wong. And take Dr. Richard Vance, he's our meteorologist. His data on this storm is crucial. The 3 additional personnel climbed aboard, cramming themselves into the limited space with Sarah Hendricks. The weight pushed the Whisper 7 to maximum capacity, but the aircraft had been designed with precisely this scenario in mind. "The rest of you," Natasha ordered Torres, "secure yourselves in the strongest remaining shelter. I'll be back for additional extraction as soon as I get these 4 to Summit Ridge. Can your supplies hold for another 3 hours? We'll make it work. Just come back for us." Natasha sealed the cockpit, checking that all passengers were properly secured. Dr. Hendricks remained unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. The others looked terrified but determined, trusting their lives to an aircraft they'd mocked less than 2 weeks ago. Summit Ridge Command, Whisper 7 departing deep field with 4 personnel, including critical medical case. Remaining camp personnel secured pending second extraction flight. "Copy that, Whisper 7, Keller responded. "Weather at your location?" Natasha glanced at the instruments. Wind speeds had increased to 147 kilometers per hour. Visibility was under 50 meters and dropping. The storm was intensifying faster than even the most pessimistic projections had predicted. Severe and deteriorating. Beginning return flight now. She lifted off, the Whisper 7 rising through the maelstrom with the additional weight, making every control input more consequential. The aircraft's performance margins had narrowed considerably, but it remained within operational limits barely. The return flight was more challenging than the outbound journey. The storm had intensified in the 40 minutes since she'd left Summit Ridge, and the Whisper 7 was now carrying nearly double its normal payload. Turbulence that the aircraft had shrugged off earlier now required her full attention and skill to navigate safely. 15 minutes into the return flight, one of the passengers, Dr. Park, leaned forward, his face pale with more than just cold. "Dr. Reeves, Sarah's breathing is getting worse. I think she might be going into shock." Natasha couldn't turn around to assess the patient directly, not while flying through these conditions. "Check her pulse. Tell me what you feel." A pause, rapid but weak. "Her skin is cold and clammy. Shock from blood loss and head trauma. Critical but manageable if they reached Summit Ridge quickly." Natasha increased power, pushing the Whisper 7 to maximum sustainable speed despite the risk. The aircraft responded, accelerating through the storm with the wounded researcher's life hanging in the balance. Summit Ridge, Whisper 7. Medical emergency in passenger compartment. Patient in possible shock. Request medical team ready for immediate intervention upon landing. "Medical team standing by," Patricia's voice responded. ETA. 22 minutes at current speed. Those 22 minutes stretched like hours. Natasha flew with absolute concentration, every sense focused on keeping the aircraft stable while maximizing speed. Behind her, Dr. Park and the others did what they could for Sarah Hendricks, their improvised emergency care all that stood between her and death. Summit Ridge appeared on the instruments with blessed relief, the station's thermal signature cutting through the storm's chaos. Natasha began her approach, the Whisper 7 descending toward the hangar with precious cargo that couldn't afford any mistakes. She set down inside the hangar with mechanical precision, the skids touching concrete as gently as if landing in perfect weather. The moment the rotors began spooling down, the hangar erupted with activity. Medical personnel rushed forward with a gurney. Patricia coordinated the extraction with practiced efficiency. Dr. Sarah Hendricks was lifted from the aircraft and rushed toward the medical bay, Natasha following immediately behind. Her piloting mission was complete, but her role as medical officer was just beginning, and 4 more people remained at the deep field camp, waiting for a second rescue that would have to happen in conditions even worse than what she'd just survived. The medical bay became a controlled storm of its own as Natasha worked to stabilize Dr. Sarah Hendricks. The head injury was severe, a depressed skull fracture with significant bleeding that had created dangerous intracranial pressure. Patricia assisted with practiced efficiency, handing instruments and monitoring vital signs, while Natasha worked with focused intensity. Blood pressure dropping, Patricia announced, eyes fixed on the monitors. 80/50 and falling. Natasha's hands moved with surgical precision, establishing intravenous access and administering fluids to counteract the shock. Start pressors. We need to maintain cerebral perfusion until we can evacuate her to a proper trauma center. Evacuate? Patricia's voice carried bitter irony. In case you haven't noticed, we're in the middle of a Category 4 storm. There's no evacuation possible for at least 48 hours. Then we stabilize her here and hope 48 hours is soon enough. Natasha continued working, her medical training taking over while another part of her mind remained focused on the larger crisis. 4 people still waited at the deep field camp in conditions that were deteriorating by the minute. 20 minutes later, Sarah Hendricks's condition had stabilized to the point where Natasha felt comfortable stepping away. The researcher remained unconscious, but her vital signs had improved to acceptable ranges. Patricia would monitor her continuously while Natasha addressed the more immediate problem. Patricia Okonkwo stepped forward. "Commander, with respect, we need to consider all options. If Dr. Reeves believes her aircraft can operate in these conditions, her belief doesn't matter." Vaughn's composure finally cracked. "I'm responsible for safety at this facility. I won't authorize untested equipment in crisis conditions based on vague claims about capabilities. We'll wait for weather to improve and complete the evacuation with proven systems." "And if weather doesn't improve?" Keller asked quietly. Vaughn had no answer. Because the truth, the reality he was being forced to confront, was that his proven systems had reached their limits. And the people he was responsible for protecting were running out of time. The second Sikorsky limped back to Summit Ridge an hour later, Frank Morrison visibly shaken as he climbed from the cockpit. Natasha watched from the hangar as Vaughn debriefed him, the conversation too distant to hear but body language conveying everything necessary. Morrison was adamant conditions were beyond safe operating parameters. For the Sikorsky airframes. As evening approached, though the perpetual daylight made evening a relative concept, the storm's outer bands reached Summit Ridge. Wind speeds increased dramatically, howling around the station's modules with predatory fury. Snow began falling, not the gentle Antarctic flurries, but horizontal sheets driven by winds that would soon exceed hurricane force. Natasha stood at the observation window of her quarters, watching the Whisper 7 through the intensifying storm. The compact helicopter remained secured in the hangar, protected but unused. A tool dismissed as inadequate by people who couldn't imagine circumstances where their assumptions failed. Her communicator chimed. Patricia's voice. "Command center, now. Something's happened at the deep field camp." She arrived to find grim faces gathered around the communication console. Dr. Keller was speaking into the radio, his voice tight with controlled fear. "Say again, deep field. You have an injury?" The response crackled through heavy static. "Medical emergency. Dr. Sarah Hendricks, she was securing equipment when a wind gust collapsed one of the tents." Metal frame struck her head. She's unconscious, bleeding. We need immediate evacuation. Natasha felt ice crystallize in her chest. Not just 8 people facing a storm now. 8 people with one critically injured, requiring urgent medical attention that was 200 kilometers away. Across impossible weather, Vaughn was already shaking his head. Current conditions make Sikorsky flight suicidal. We can't, Commander, Natasha interrupted, her voice cutting through the paralysis. I can reach them. The Whisper 7 can handle these conditions. Let me bring Dr. Hendricks back. You don't know that it can handle these conditions. Yes, I do. Because I've flown this exact aircraft in worse. Let me show you. Their eyes locked across the command center, this moment crystallizing 7 days of institutional dismissal against escalating crisis. Vaughn still wanted to believe his systems would be sufficient. But reality had other plans. And 8 people were running out of time. The wind screamed against the hangar, doors with the fury of something alive and malevolent. Inside, Natasha moved through final pre-flight checks with absolute focus. Her hands steady despite the gravity of what she was about to attempt. Behind her, the command center had erupted into controlled chaos. Vaughn stood rigid, his authority crumbling as the crisis exposed every weakness in his operational planning. Dr. Keller had taken de facto command, his scientific precision cutting through the panic. Dr. Reeves, Keller's voice carried across the hangar. You have authorization to attempt rescue flight. Bring Dr. Hendricks back alive. Vaughn's face had gone gray, but he said nothing. The decision had been taken from his hands by circumstances he could no longer control. Patricia appeared at Natasha's side, helping secure emergency medical supplies in the Whisper 7's compact cargo space. Tell me you actually know what you're doing. I've flown extractions in winds exceeding 200 kilometers per hour. I've navigated through total whiteout conditions, where visibility was measured in centimeters. This aircraft was designed by people who understood that conventional wisdom kills pilots. Natasha met her gaze steadily. I know exactly what I'm doing. Then go save our people. Thomas Chun rushed over with a data pad. Latest atmospheric readings from the deep field camp. Winds gusting to 120 kilometers per hour. Visibility under 100 meters and dropping. The storm's outer bands are fully over their position now. Natasha studied the data while simultaneously checking the Whisper 7's avionics. The numbers were severe, but within the aircraft's operational parameters, barely. Time to reach camp at current conditions? 47 minutes if you maintain optimal routing. But Dr. Reeves, the turbulence patterns. Thomas's voice trailed off. His meteorological training, unable to reconcile what she was proposing with what he understood about aviation safety. The Whisper 7's rotor system uses adaptive geometry. It actually performs better in turbulent conditions than smooth air. Counterintuitive, but that's what makes it work when everything else fails. She climbed into the cockpit. Her movements economical and precise. The instrument panel illuminated with soft blue light. Displays coming online in rapid succession. Navigation systems synchronized with satellite data. The advanced avionics that had cost 3 times what conventional systems would have began painting a 3-dimensional map of the atmospheric chaos between Summit Ridge and the deep field camp. Frank Morrison appeared at the cockpit. The senior pilot's face etched with concern and something that might have been respect. Dr. Reeves, I flew Antarctic rescue missions for 15 years before coming here. What you're attempting, I wouldn't try it in a Sikorsky. And those birds have twice your power and 3 times your mass. Different tools for different problems, Natasha replied, her fingers dancing across the control interface. The Sikorskys are magnificent aircraft within their design parameters. This situation is outside those parameters. How can you be certain your machine will handle it? Because I helped design it for exactly this scenario. Because I've tested every system under conditions that would terrify you. And because 8 people are going to die if someone doesn't reach them. She met his eyes. I'm certain because I have to be. Morrison nodded slowly, then stepped back. Bring them home. The hangar doors began their grinding ascent, wind immediately howling into the space with shocking violence. Snow blasted through the opening in horizontal sheets, visibility collapsing to near zero within seconds. The other aircraft in the hangar, the massive Sikorskys that represented conventional aviation's best technology, sat motionless. Grounded by conditions they couldn't safely navigate, Natasha engaged the Whisper 7's rotor system. The blades began their rotation with a distinctive whisper that had given the aircraft its name, a sound entirely different from the thunderous chop of conventional helicopters. The rotors achieved full speed in seconds, their adaptive geometry already adjusting to the turbulent air. Summit Ridge Command. Whisper 7 ready for departure, she transmitted. Keller's voice responded immediately. Whisper 7, you are cleared for rescue mission. Godspeed, Dr. Reeves. She lifted off smoothly, the aircraft rising from the hangar floor with almost eerie stability despite the violent winds. The moment she cleared the hangar doors, the storm's full fury struck. Wind shear that would have flipped a conventional helicopter sideways, barely registered on the Whisper 7's control surfaces. The adaptive rotors flexed and adjusted thousands of times per second, finding stable paths through chaos that human reflexes could never match. The world outside was white violence. Snow and ice crystals driven at hurricane velocities created a disorienting maelstrom where up and down became abstract concepts. Natasha's hands rested lightly on the controls, trusting the advanced avionics to handle micro-corrections while she focused on navigation and strategic decisions. Whisper 7. We're tracking your position. Thomas Chun's voice came through the headset. Atmospheric readings at your current location show winds at 138 kilometers per hour. You're entering the densest part of the storm cell. Acknowledged. Aircraft handling within normal parameters. Her voice was calm, almost conversational, while she piloted through conditions that would have panicked most aviators. The navigation display showed her position relative to the deep field Campa, glowing line cutting through topographical data and real-time weather information. The route took her over a section of broken glacier terrain, crevasse fields that were invisible beneath the snow, but deadly if she lost altitude. 15 minutes into the flight, the turbulence intensified to levels that tested even the Whisper 7's capabilities. The aircraft dropped suddenly, falling 30 meters in seconds as a massive downdraft caught it. Natasha's hands moved with practiced precision, adding power while letting the rotors find their own equilibrium. The machine recovered smoothly, climbing back to operational altitude. Whisper 7, we just saw your altitude drop significantly. Keller's voice carried obvious concern. Are you in trouble? Negative. Encountering severe downdrafts, but aircraft is compensating. Continuing toward target. She found Commander Vaughn in the command center, staring at weather displays with the hollow expression of someone watching their world collapse. The storm had intensified beyond all predictions. Wind speeds at Summit Ridge now exceeded 160 kilometers per hour. With the worst still to come. 4 people remain at Deep Field, Natasha stated without preamble. I'm going back for them. Vaughn turned slowly, and she saw something broken in his eyes. His operational confidence had shattered completely, leaving behind only raw human fear. Dr. Reeves, look at these conditions. What you accomplished bringing those 4 back was remarkable, but this... He gestured helplessly at the displays. This is suicide. It's suicide for the people at that camp if no one retrieves them. Their remaining shelter won't survive another 3 hours in these winds. Dr. Keller approached, his face grim but determined. Natasha's right. We can't abandon those people. If she believes the Whisper 7 can handle another flight, believing doesn't matter. Vaughn's voice cracked with desperation. Physics matters. Engineering limits matter. That helicopter is exceptional, I'll grant you that. But there are absolute boundaries beyond which no aircraft can operate safely. We've reached those boundaries. Thomas Chun cleared his throat nervously from his meteorological station. Actually, Commander, the weather data suggests a brief window approaching. The storm's primary rotation is passing over us now, but there's a temporary reduction in wind intensity predicted in approximately 45 minutes. It'll only last maybe 30 minutes before the back edge hits, but during that window, conditions might be marginally better. Natasha studied the atmospheric models, her experienced eye parsing the complex data. Thomas was right. There was a brief lull coming, though marginally better, still meant winds around 120 kilometers per hour. Dangerous, but within the Whisper 7's capabilities if she timed everything perfectly. That's my window, she announced. I launch in 40 minutes, reach the camp during the lull, extract the remaining personnel, and return before the back edge arrives. And if the timing doesn't work perfectly? Vaughn demanded. If the lull ends early or the back edge arrives faster than predicted, then I improvise, which is what this entire situation has required from the beginning. Natasha met his gaze steadily. Commander, your planning was based on reasonable assumptions that didn't account for this scenario. That's not a failure of competence, it's a failure of imagination. No one anticipated this storm. But now that it's here, we need to use tools that weren't part of the original plan. Frank Morrison entered the command center, still wearing his flight suit despite being grounded. I'll accompany you, Dr. Reeves. An extra set of hands for loading passengers. Backup in case something goes wrong. Natasha considered this. The additional weight would reduce her performance margins, but having experienced assistance at the camp would speed up the extraction process. Agreed. But you follow my operational instructions without question. This isn't a conventional flight. I'm very aware of that. Morrison's weathered face held profound respect. What you did earlier, I've never seen flying like that. I'll defer to your judgment completely. The 40-minute preparation window passed with agonizing slowness. Natasha conducted another complete pre-flight inspection of the Whisper 7. Checking every system that had just been stressed to its limits. The aircraft had performed flawlessly during the first rescue, but metal and electronics had tolerances that could fail without warning. Patricia found her in the hangar, helping to load additional emergency supplies. Sarah Hendricks is stable but still critical. If you don't make it back, then you'll do everything possible to keep her alive until weather permits full evacuation. Natasha secured the cargo with practiced efficiency. But I will make it back. This is what the Whisper 7 was designed for. I hope you're right. Because if you're wrong, you're going to die out there. And those 4 people at the camp will die anyway when their shelter collapses. Optimistic as always. Patricia managed a weak smile. Someone has to balance out your terrifying confidence. Dr. Keller appeared with updated weather data. The lull window is beginning. Thomas says you have approximately 34 minutes of reduced wind intensity, starting now. Natasha climbed into the cockpit, Morrison settling into the co-pilot seat with obvious tension. He was an experienced aviator, placing his life in the hands of an aircraft and pilot he dismissed just days earlier. The psychological adjustment was written clearly across his features. Summit Ridge Command. Whisper 7 ready for second extraction flight, Natasha transmitted. Whisper 7. You are cleared for departure. Keller's voice carried obvious strain. Bring everyone home, Natasha. The hangar doors ground open, revealing a world transformed by violence. The storm had reached its peak intensity at Summit Ridge, wind screaming between buildings with destructive force. Equipment that hadn't been properly secured tumbled across the ice like children's toys. The sky had darkened to an apocalyptic gray-black, despite the Antarctic summer's continuous daylight. Natasha lifted off. the Whisper 7 rising through marginally reduced turbulence. The lull was relative conditions. That would have seemed catastrophic under normal circumstances, now qualified as a temporary improvement simply because they weren't quite as deadly as before. Morrison gripped his restraints as the helicopter punched through a violent crosswind. Jesus, this is your idea of better conditions? This is flyable. What we experienced earlier wasn't. Natasha's voice remained calm while her hands made constant micro-adjustments. The difference matters, even if both seem impossible. The flight to the deep field camp tested every skill she'd accumulated over 15 years of extreme environment aviation. The atmospheric chaos created constantly shifting conditions that required split-second decisions and absolute trust in her instruments. Morrison watched her work with obvious amazement, recognizing expertise that operated on a level entirely beyond his experience. "You're not human," he muttered at one point, watching her navigate through a turbulence pattern that should have torn them from the sky. "No human can process information this fast and react with this precision. I'm very human. But I've trained for scenarios most people can't imagine. This storm is severe, but it's not the worst I've flown through." She adjusted their heading, avoiding a particularly violent cell of turbulence. 4 years ago, I extracted a research team from the Arctic during a polar cyclone with sustained winds exceeding 240 kilometers per hour. Compared to that, this is manageable. The deep field camp appeared on her instruments exactly on schedule. The remaining shelter was barely standing, fabric shredded in multiple places, structural supports bent to breaking point. The 4 personnel huddled inside were visible on thermal imaging, their heat signatures weak with exhaustion and hypothermia. Natasha descended through the chaos, every instinct screaming that landing in these conditions violated basic aviation safety. But the alternative was abandoning 4 people to certain death, which wasn't an alternative at all. The Whisper 7 touched down with Morrison already unstrapping, throwing open his door the moment the skids contacted ice. Wind immediately tried to rip the door away. He held it with desperate strength, waving frantically toward the shelter. Dr. Michael Torres and his 3 remaining team members emerged, bent nearly horizontal against the wind, struggling toward the helicopter with obvious desperation. Morrison reached out, grabbing the first researcher and physically hauling her into the passenger compartment. The others followed, cramming themselves into the limited space. "Everyone accounted for," Morrison shouted over the combined roar of wind and rotors. "Get us out of here." Natasha lifted off immediately, the Whisper 7 straining under maximum payload in the worst conditions imaginable. The aircraft climbed with agonizing slowness, fighting for every meter of altitude while wind tried to dash them against the ice. "How much time left in the weather window?" Morrison asked, checking their navigation display. 11 minutes. "We need 14 to reach Summit Ridge." The implications settled between them with crushing weight. The lull was ending early, and they would still be airborne when the storm's back edge hit with renewed fury. "Can we make it?" "We're about to find out." Natasha pushed the Whisper 7 to maximum speed, the aircraft screaming through the storm at velocities that stressed every component. The passengers behind them remained silent, recognizing from her intensity that their situation was even more desperate than they'd realized. 8 minutes into the flight, the atmospheric conditions shifted dramatically. The brief lull ended with shocking abruptness as the storm's trailing edge arrived ahead of schedule. Wind speeds that had dropped to 120 kilometers per hour suddenly spiked back to 170. Then beyond. The Whisper 7 shuddered violently, dropping 30 meters in seconds as a massive downdraft caught them. Natasha fought the controls with every ounce of skill and strength, adding maximum power while letting the adaptive rotors find stable configurations through chaos. "We're not going to make it," Morrison said quietly. watching the instruments with the fatalistic acceptance of an experienced pilot recognizing impossible odds. "Yes, we are." Natasha's voice carried absolute conviction, despite the hurricane trying to tear them from the sky. This aircraft was designed by people who understood that impossible is just a failure of engineering. "Hold on." She executed a maneuver that should have been impossible, a controlled descent that used the storm's violence rather than fighting it. Finding corridors of slightly less chaotic air through intuition and instrument precision that bordered on supernatural. The Whisper 7 plummeted toward the ice, then arrested its descent at the last possible moment. Climbing again through a gap in the turbulence that existed for mere seconds, Summit Ridge appeared through the maelstrom, the station's lights blazing like a beacon of salvation. Natasha aimed for it with single-minded determination. The helicopter fighting through the final kilometers with the storm, doing everything possible to prevent their survival. The hangar doors stood open. Personnel visible inside, waving frantically. Natasha approached with the last reserves of the aircraft's capability. The Whisper 7 barely maintaining controlled flight as they crossed the threshold. She set down hard, the landing brutal but survivable. The moment the skids contacted concrete, the hangar erupted with activity. Hands reached in, pulling the rescued personnel to safety. Morrison climbed out shakily, his face pale with the aftereffects of experiencing aviation beyond his comprehension. Natasha shut down the Whisper 7 systems with methodical precision, her hands steady despite having just flown through conditions that violated every principle of safe aviation. The rotors spooled down gradually, their distinctive whisper fading as the aircraft settled into stillness. All 8 people from the deep field camp were now safely at Summit Ridge. Dr. Sarah Hendricks remained stable in medical care. The storm continued raging outside with apocalyptic fury, but everyone was inside, protected, alive. Natasha climbed from the cockpit to find the entire station's personnel gathered in the hangar. The mockery, the dismissiveness, the casual contempt, all of it had evaporated, replaced by something that looked like awe. Commander Vaughn approached slowly, his expression complex with emotions he clearly struggled to process. "Dr. Reeves, what you just accomplished... His voice failed, unable to find words adequate to the moment. "I flew a helicopter designed for extreme conditions through exactly the scenario it was built to handle," Natasha replied simply. "That's not a miracle. That's engineering and training. No one else could have done what you just did. That's because no one else had the right tool. Your Sikorskys are magnificent aircraft, Commander. But this situation required something different. Something most people would dismiss as inadequate because it doesn't fit conventional expectations." The toy helicopter that everyone had mocked now stood in the center of the hangar, battered but intact, having saved 8 lives that conventional aviation had written off as lost. The storm reached its absolute peak 2 hours after Natasha's final rescue flight. Winds screaming past Summit Ridge at velocities that transformed the research station into a besieged fortress. Metal groaned under the assault. Windows rattled in their reinforced frames. The entire facility shuddered with each powerful gust, reminding everyone inside how fragile human infrastructure became when nature decided to demonstrate its supremacy. Natasha stood in the medical bay, monitoring Dr. Sarah Hendricks while the rescued researcher drifted in and out of consciousness. The head injury remained serious, but her vital signs had stabilized enough that Natasha felt cautiously optimistic about her survival until proper evacuation became possible. "She's going to make it," Patricia observed quietly, reviewing the monitoring equipment. "Because you got to her in time. Another 3 hours at that camp, and she'd have died from shock and exposure." "We got to her in time," Natasha corrected. This wasn't a solo effort. The door opened and Commander Vaughn entered, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose entire worldview had been fundamentally restructured. He approached hesitantly, as if uncertain of his welcome in what had technically been designated as Natasha's domain. "Dr. Reeves, may I speak with you?" Natasha nodded, gesturing Patricia to continue monitoring while she stepped into the corridor with Vaughn. The commander looked like he'd aged a decade in the past 12 hours. His weathered features carrying new lines of stress and something that might have been shame. "I owe you an apology," he began without preamble. "Actually, I owe you several apologies. For dismissing your concerns. For mocking your aircraft. For letting institutional arrogance blind me to capabilities I didn't understand." He paused, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easily. "You saved 8 lives today. Lives that would have been lost because of my refusal to consider alternatives to my operational planning. Commander, your planning was based on reasonable assumptions using the resources you understood. The problem wasn't incompetence, it was that this situation exceeded the boundaries of conventional thinking. That's generous, but it doesn't change the facts. I almost killed those people through stubborn adherence to my own limitations." Vaughn met her gaze directly. "Who are you really, Dr. Reeves? Your file says medical officer, but what you demonstrated today, that's not standard qualification." Natasha considered how much to reveal. The crisis had passed the point where maintaining complete operational security mattered more than building necessary trust. "I spent 15 years with Arctic Emergency Response Division, flying rescue missions in the most extreme environments on Earth. The Whisper 7 isn't some experimental prototype. The result of a decade-long development program I helped design specifically for scenarios where conventional aviation fails." "Why not say that from the beginning?" "Because I was sent here under circumstances that required discretion. Summit Ridge had developed concerning patterns maintenance deferrals, ignored weather warnings, a culture that prioritized research objectives over operational safety. My assignment was to assess whether those patterns represented genuine systemic risk." Understanding dawned in Vaughn's expression, followed by anger that seemed directed entirely at himself. "You were investigating us, evaluating whether we were creating conditions for disaster, and unfortunately finding confirmation that you were. Not through malice or recklessness, but through the subtle erosion of safety margins that happens when success breeds overconfidence." Natasha's voice remained neutral, clinical. 7 years of operations without major incident created institutional faith in systems that had never been genuinely tested. This storm provided that test, and exposed how badly we would have failed without your intervention. Vaughn was silent for a long moment, processing implications that clearly troubled him deeply. "What happens now? Official investigation? Disciplinary action? That depends on what you do with this experience. Systems that learn from near disasters and implement genuine reforms are valuable. Systems that return to comfortable assumptions once the immediate crisis passes are dangerous." She held his gaze steadily. "Which kind of system will Summit Ridge become?" Before Vaughn could respond, Dr. Adrian Keller appeared in the corridor, his expression urgent. "Command Center, now, we have a new problem." They followed him quickly, arriving to find Thomas Chun staring at meteorological displays with obvious distress. The young meteorologist looked up as they entered, his face pale. "The storm is stalling. The atmospheric models predicted it would pass through in approximately 18 hours, but it's losing forward momentum. Current projections show it remaining over our position for potentially 48 to 72 hours. Natasha studied the data with growing concern. A storm of this intensity typically moved through quickly, its violence offset by its transient nature. But if the system stalled, if Summit Ridge remained under hurricane-force winds for days rather than hours, the cumulative damage could be catastrophic. What are our critical vulnerabilities? She asked. Patricia pulled up infrastructure schematics. Power generation is our primary concern. We have backup generators, But sustained operations under extreme load for 72 hours will stress them beyond design specifications. If we lose power in these temperatures, we have maybe 6 hours before occupied modules become uninhabitable. Fuel reserves for the generators? Sufficient for 96 hours at normal consumption. But these aren't normal conditions. Heating loads are triple standard operating parameters. Vaughn had recovered some of his operational focus, the immediate crisis pulling him back into command mode. We implement strict power conservation. Non-essential systems offline immediately. Consolidate personnel into fewer modules to concentrate heating. Reduce lighting to minimum safe levels. We also need to consider structural integrity, Keller added, pointing to stress monitors throughout the facility. Module 7 is showing concerning flex patterns. The connecting corridor to Module 8 has developed a seal breach minor now. But it could worsen if the storm continues. Natasha moved between displays, her mind cataloging problems with the systematic precision of someone trained to function during cascading crises. We need damage assessment teams checking critical systems every 4 hours. Priority on power generation, heating distribution, and structural integrity. Any degradation gets addressed immediately before it compounds into catastrophic failure. Over the following hours, Summit Ridge transformed from research facility to survival operation. Personnel not assigned to essential duties were consolidated into the 3 most structurally sound modules. Power consumption was reduced to absolute minimums. Damage assessment teams rotated through brutal 4-hour shifts, venturing into the storm's fury to check external systems and seal emerging breaches. Natasha found herself coordinating much of this effort alongside Vaughn, her crisis management experience complementing his operational knowledge. The partnership was unexpected, but effective. Vaughn's pride had been sufficiently humbled that he actually listened to suggestions and implemented recommendations without the defensive resistance that had characterized their earlier interactions. 18 hours into the stalled storm, the first generator began showing signs of stress. Thomas Chen detected it during routine monitoring, the temperature readings climbing above safe operational thresholds. Generator 2 is overheating, he announced in the command center. If it continues, we're looking at potential failure within 6 to 8 hours. Can we reduce load on that generator and redistribute? Vaughn asked the engineering team. The lead engineer, a taciturn woman named Dr. Rebecca Foster, shook her head grimly. We're already running at minimum necessary distribution. Reducing load further means choosing which modules go without power. Then we need to repair Generator 2, Natasha stated. What's the failure mechanism? Cooling system can't keep up with the extreme ambient conditions. The intake vents are getting blocked with ice formation from the wind-driven snow. Under normal circumstances, we just clear the vents every few hours. But in this storm, accessing the generator housing means sending someone outside into winds exceeding 180 kilometers per hour. The implications settled heavily. Clearing the vents was necessary to keep the generator operational. But doing so required exposing someone to conditions that could literally kill them in minutes. I'll go, Frank Morrison volunteered immediately. I've done external maintenance before. Not in conditions like this, Rebecca countered. The wind will knock you off your feet the moment you leave the airlock. You'd need to be tethered, and even then, the force could cause serious injury. Natasha studied the facility schematics, calculating distances and exposure times. How long to clear the vents? Maybe 5 minutes if you know what you're doing. But that's 5 minutes in those winds, which might as well be 5 hours in normal weather. I've done cold weather operations in worse conditions, Natasha said calmly. Give me detailed instructions on the vent system, and I'll handle it. Dr. Reeves, this is insane, Keller protested. You've already risked your life twice today. We can find another solution. What solution? We need that generator operational, and I have the most experience working in extreme environments. She met the gathered personnel's concerned gazes. This is manageable risk with proper precautions. I've done similar repairs in Arctic blizzards with comparable wind speeds. 30 minutes later, Natasha stood in the airlock dressed in the most advanced cold weather gear the station possessed. Tethered with high-strength cables designed to handle the wind loads she was about to face. Rebecca Foster had given her detailed instructions on the vent system, and she'd memorized every step with perfect recall. "You have 5 minutes maximum," Patricia's voice came through her helmet communication system. "Any longer, and you risk hypothermia or worse. We'll monitor your vital signs continuously." "Understood." Opening airlock now. The outer door swung inward, and the storm's full violence hit her like a physical wall. Wind that had seemed abstract on monitoring displays became brutally real, trying to tear her from her feet with shocking force. The tether cables went taut immediately, the only thing preventing her from being launched across the ice. Natasha leaned into the wind, using its force rather than fighting it, making progress in short, controlled movements. The generator housing was only 15 meters from the airlock, but covering that distance felt like climbing a mountain. Snow and ice driven at hurricane velocities sandblasted her protective gear. Visibility reduced to barely a meter despite the powerful headlamp. She reached the generator housing, finding the intake vents exactly where Rebecca had described, already half-blocked, with ice that had built up rapidly in the extreme conditions. Natasha pulled the de-icing tool from her equipment belt and began working with methodical precision, despite the chaos around her. Vital signs elevated, but acceptable. Patricia reported through the CUM system. "You've been outside 90 seconds. The ice came away in chunks, revealing the vents beneath." Natasha worked systematically, clearing each section while the storm tried its absolute best to kill her. The wind seemed to gain strength, gusts that felt like being hit by moving vehicles. Without the tether, she would have been dead within seconds. 3 minutes. "Generator temperature is dropping. Whatever you're doing is working." Natasha cleared the final vent section, double-checking her work with freezing fingers. The entire system was now clean, allowing proper airflow to cool the overworked generator. Task complete. Returning to airlock. The return journey was if anything more difficult than the outbound trip. The wind had shifted direction slightly, now hitting her from an angle that made maintaining balance even more challenging. She moved in careful increments, using the tether for stability, fighting for every meter of progress. 4 minutes 30 seconds after leaving, she tumbled back through the airlock door. Personnel immediately sealed it behind her, the sudden absence of wind almost disorienting after the violence outside. Hands helped her remove the ice-crusted outer gear, checking for injuries or frostbite. "That was the most terrifying thing I've ever watched," Patricia said, examining Natasha's exposed skin for cold damage. "Your core temperature dropped 3 degrees. But generator 2? Rebecca Foster was already checking the systems. Temperature stabilized. "You saved it. We've got power security for the duration of the storm now." In the command center, Vaughn watched the generator readouts with obvious relief. When Natasha returned after warming up and undergoing medical assessment, he approached with an expression that mixed admiration and something like disbelief. "You've saved this station 3 times in the past 24 hours. The rescue's now this." "I don't know how to properly express." "You express it by learning," Natasha interrupted gently. "By taking these lessons and building systems that don't require heroic intervention when things go wrong. By creating a culture where questioning assumptions is rewarded rather than punished." "I will. We will." Vaughn's commitment seemed genuine, forged in the crucible of crisis. "Summit Ridge will be different because of what happened here." The storm continued for another 48 hours, gradually diminishing in intensity until it finally broke apart and dispersed. By the time weather cleared enough for satellite communication with the outside world, Summit Ridge had survived what meteorologists would later classify as one of the most intense Antarctic storms on record. The facility had sustained significant damage, collapsed structures, damaged equipment, depleted supplies. But no lives had been lost. Everyone remained safe because when conventional systems failed, alternatives existed that could handle the impossible. In the hangar, Natasha conducted post-storm inspection of the Whisper 7. The aircraft showed stress from its repeated flights through catastrophic conditions. But the fundamental systems remained sound. With proper maintenance, it would be ready for whatever came next. She found Frank Morrison standing nearby, studying the compact helicopter with newfound reverence. "I've been flying for 23 years, he said quietly. "Thought I understood what aviation meant, what limits actually were. Then you showed up with this toy and demonstrated that my understanding was just comfortable assumptions mistaken for truth." "The Whisper 7 isn't magic," Natasha replied. "It's just engineering that started from different premises. Instead of asking, how do we build a helicopter that works in normal conditions, the designers asked, how do we build one that works when everything goes wrong?" Different question, different answer. Morrison nodded slowly. Different survival. The compact helicopter that everyone had mocked now sat as testament to the value of preparation for scenarios conventional wisdom dismissed as impossible. It hadn't replaced the massive Sikorskys that dominated the hangar. Both had roles. Both had value. But when the impossible became real, the toy had been their salvation. 3 weeks after the storm, Summit Ridge had transformed from survival mode back to operational status. Though the facility bore visible scars from its ordeal, temporary patches covered structural damage. Replacement equipment arrived on cargo flights now that weather permitted regular transportation. The deep field camp had been completely dismantled. Its twisted remains a testament to forces that could have easily claimed 8 lives. Dr. Sarah Hendricks had been evacuated to a proper medical facility in Christchurch, where surgeons successfully addressed her skull fracture. Early reports suggested full recovery, though she would never return to Antarctic fieldwork. The head injury had been too severe, the risk of complications from future cold exposure too significant. Natasha stood in the communications module, finalizing her incident report for Arctic Emergency Response Division. The document ran to 47 pages of technical analysis, meteorological data, operational assessments, and recommendations for systemic reforms. Her conclusions were diplomatic but unambiguous. Summit Ridge had nearly experienced catastrophic loss of life due to institutional complacency masked as operational confidence. "Your report is going to cause significant disruption," Dr. Adrian Keller observed, reading over her shoulder with permission. "Several careers will likely end because of what you're documenting here. Several careers should end if they're built on patterns that endanger lives," Natasha replied without apology. "But the goal isn't punishment, it's preventing this situation from developing elsewhere. Every polar research facility needs to examine whether they've made the same mistakes. Summit Ridge did. Building safety systems that look impressive on paper, but haven't been genuinely tested against worst-case scenarios." Exactly. The paradox is that successful operations create the conditions for future failure. 7 years without major incident convinced everyone here that your systems were robust, when actually you'd just been lucky with weather. She saved the document and initiated encrypted transmission. Real robustness only reveals itself when everything goes wrong simultaneously. Commander Vaughn entered the communications module, moving with the careful humility of someone still processing how completely his worldview had been restructured. In the 3 weeks since the storm, he'd thrown himself into implementing reforms with the intensity of someone seeking redemption through action. "Dr. Reeves, I wanted to inform you personally. I've submitted my resignation as station commander, effective at the end of this operational season. Natasha turned to face him fully. That wasn't my recommendation, Commander. Perhaps not explicitly, but your report makes clear that leadership failures enabled the conditions that nearly killed those people. I can't in good conscience continue in this role knowing I almost destroyed this entire facility through arrogance. What you almost destroyed was already being rebuilt the moment you acknowledged the problems, Natasha countered. Leadership that learns from catastrophic mistakes is more valuable than leadership that's never been tested. Anyone can command successfully when conditions remain favorable. The measure of real leadership is how you respond when everything collapses. Vaughn absorbed this silently, clearly unconvinced. Keller stepped forward, adding his perspective. Natasha's right, Derek. You've implemented more safety reforms in 3 weeks than this facility saw in 7 years. The revised maintenance protocols, the enhanced weather monitoring, the emergency response restructuring, those changes will save lives long after this season ends. Walking away now would waste all the hard lessons you've learned. I'll reconsider, Vaughn said finally, though uncertainty remained in his expression. But regardless of whether I stay, the reforms will continue. That much I can guarantee. After Vaughn departed, Natasha completed her final administrative tasks. Her assignment to Summit Ridge was concluding. The crisis had been resolved. The systemic vulnerabilities exposed and addressed. Her actual expertise no longer required to remain concealed behind a medical officer cover story. Patricia Okonkwo found her in the hangar that evening, conducting what had become a ritual final inspection of the Whisper 7. The compact helicopter would be departing with her, returning to Arctic Emergency Response Division for maintenance and reassignment. So you're really leaving, Patricia observed, settling onto an equipment crate. Just when you were becoming tolerable. My work here is complete. The reforms are in motion. The cultural changes are taking root. Staying longer would just create dependency on external oversight rather than internal accountability. Still, it won't be the same without you. Patricia's expression turned serious. You saved lives, Natasha. Not just during the storm, but by forcing this entire facility to confront truths we'd been avoiding. That matters more than operational reports can quantify. The real test comes next season, when memory of the crisis fades and comfortable assumptions try to reassert themselves. That's when Summit Ridge will discover whether the changes are genuine or just temporary reactions to fear. The following morning brought Natasha's departure flight, a conventional cargo transport that would carry her and the Whisper 7 back to Christchurch, then onward to her next assignment. Most of the station's personnel gathered in the hangar for an informal farewell. Their presence a stark contrast to her arrival 3 months earlier when she'd been dismissed as insignificant support staff. Thomas Chen approached nervously, carrying a data storage device. Dr. Reeves, I compiled all the meteorological data from the storm. The atmospheric dynamics were unprecedented. The research community will be studying this event for years. I wanted you to have a complete copy, since you were, well, inside the phenomenon in ways no instruments could measure. Appreciated, Thomas. Your analysis was critical to timing those rescue flights. Trust your data next time, even when authority figures dismiss it. Frank Morrison stepped forward next, extending his hand with obvious respect. I've recommended to headquarters that all polar aviation personnel receive training on the Whisper 7 platform. What that aircraft can do, what you demonstrated it could do, needs to become standard capability, not specialized expertise. The technology is being declassified, Natasha confirmed, shaking his hand. Within 2 years, machines like the Whisper 7 should be available to research facilities globally. Though the aircraft is only half the equation, proper training in extreme condition aviation is equally critical. Dr. Rebecca Foster, the engineer who directed the generator repairs, approached with characteristic directness. "Your helicopter, I'd like to study the rotor dynamics and adaptive control systems. The engineering principles could apply to other extreme environment equipment beyond aviation. Contact Arctic Emergency Response Division. They're beginning a technology transfer program for exactly that purpose." Natasha smiled slightly. The goal was never keeping these capabilities secret. It was developing them to the point where they could be shared safely. Finally, Commander Vaughn approached, his weathered features carrying complex emotions. "Dr. Reeves, Natasha, I won't forget what you taught me here. About humility, about recognizing limits, about the difference between confidence and competence." He paused, struggling with words. "About how the tools we dismiss as inadequate are sometimes exactly what we need when our preferred systems fail. Remember those lessons when the next crisis develops somewhere else, Commander. Because there will always be a next crisis, and it will always exceed someone's comfortable assumptions." As the cargo transport's engines spooled up, Natasha took one final look at Summit Ridge Research Station. The facility had been transformed by crisis, its personnel forced to confront truths about systemic vulnerabilities that comfortable success had concealed. Whether those lessons would endure or gradually erode remained to be seen. She climbed aboard, the Whisper 7 secured in the cargo bay, and the transport lifted off into clear Antarctic skies. Below, the station shrank to a collection of modules surrounded by endless ice, looking simultaneously permanent and fragile in the vast white emptiness. 6 months later, Natasha received an encrypted message while conducting cold weather testing in northern Alaska. The sender was Dr. Adrian Keller, now serving as interim station director at Summit Ridge following Vaughn's decision to accept a position training polar aviation personnel instead of continuing in command. The message contained operational reports from the facility's first major weather event under the new protocols. A significant storm system had approached Summit Ridge, nothing like the catastrophic cyclone that had struck during Natasha's tenure, but severe enough to test the revised procedures. The deep field camps had been evacuated early, before conditions deteriorated. Equipment maintenance had been current, with no deferred inspections creating hidden vulnerabilities. Personnel had questioned operational assumptions rather than accepting them reflexively. The facility had weathered the storm without incident, its systems performing exactly as designed, because they'd been genuinely prepared rather than theoretically adequate. Most significantly, the 2 Sikorsky helicopters had been supplemented by a newly acquired Whisper 7 unit, stationed at Summit Ridge as permanent backup for extreme condition operations. The toy helicopter had been integrated into standard protocols, no longer dismissed but recognized as a critical capability for scenarios where conventional aviation reached its limits. Keller's message concluded with a simple observation: "The culture here has genuinely changed. People ask uncomfortable questions now. They challenge assumptions. They prepare for scenarios that statistics suggest are unlikely, but physics confirms are possible." You didn't just save 8 lives during that storm, Natasha. You saved everyone who will work at Summit Ridge in all the years to come, by teaching us that the most dangerous confidence is confidence that's never been tested. Natasha archived the message and returned to her current assignment, evaluating safety protocols at a high-altitude research facility in the Himalayas where concerning patterns had emerged. Different location, different specific vulnerabilities, but the same fundamental problem: institutional confidence exceeding actual capability. Comfortable assumptions mistaken for robust systems. The Whisper 7 sat nearby, compact and unassuming, ready for whatever scenarios conventional wisdom insisted were impossible. A tool that would be dismissed and mocked until the moment it became the difference between survival and catastrophe. Somewhere in the world, people were laughing at equipment they considered inadequate, at preparations they deemed excessive, at warnings they thought were overly cautious. They were building systems that looked impressive on paper while failing to address the gaps between theoretical capability and actual performance under crisis conditions. They were creating the conditions for the next disaster. And when that disaster arrived, when comfortable assumptions shattered against harsh reality, Natasha would be there with the tools and expertise that had been dismissed as unnecessary, not seeking vindication or recognition, but simply ensuring that when the impossible became real, alternatives existed that could handle what conventional systems could not. The compact helicopter that everyone had called a toy until it saved their lives, the expertise that had been concealed behind a maintenance technician's uniform until crisis revealed its true value, the uncomfortable truths that people mocked, until those truths became the only things standing between them and death. In research facilities across the most extreme environments on Earth, the lessons from Summit Ridge were gradually spreading. New protocols emerged. Cultural changes took root. Equipment previously dismissed as unnecessary was being integrated into standard operations. The mockery was fading, replaced by understanding that had been purchased at the price of near-catastrophe. And somewhere in the Antarctic, a research station that had almost been destroyed by its own confidence now operated under principles that acknowledged a fundamental truth. The most valuable capabilities are often the ones you hope never to use, but absolutely need when every comfortable assumption collapses simultaneously. They had laughed at her toy helicopter. Until it was their only way out. And now, 3 months after that realization, they would never laugh at tools built for impossible scenarios again, because they had learned, in the most visceral way possible, that impossible is just another word for hasn't happened yet. The story of Summit Ridge would be told in safety briefings and training programs for years to come, not as a tale of heroic rescue, but as a case study in institutional complacency and the deadly gap between confidence and capability. And at the center of that story would be a compact helicopter and the woman who flew it through conditions that should have been impossible, demonstrating that preparation for worst-case scenarios isn't paranoia, it's the only rational response to operating in environments where nature makes no allowances for human assumptions. The laughter had stopped. The lessons remained, and lives would be saved because of both. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.